Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lyft Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lyft Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational next economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lyfteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lyfteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy. Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy, and I'm here at episode 100 with my business partner, Kevin Bayuk. We started this podcast in November 2015, so over 2 years. And it's been 100 episodes, so we thought we'd do a reprise of our sort of episode, but with some slight variations towards, the sort of Lyft vision and the origin of the team at Lyft Economy and what we had hoped to accomplish. Because a lot of folks over the years have asked us, what is Lyft and why is your mission to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life? Not many companies have an aspirational mission like that. So Kevin and I thought today we could give listeners a little bit of a backdrop to that. And so I'm here with Kevin, who is a co-founder and partner and worker owner at Lyft. Hi, Kevin.
Hey, Ryan. 100 episodes. All right.
100 episodes. So we thought, maybe, I don't think many folks know your background. We do this with every guest. So maybe in broad strokes, just talking a little bit about your background, maybe up through your tech company, to talk to folks about how you came to this sort of interest in permaculture in the next economy.
All right. We'll dive back and through to the tech era. And I guess the setting is the Bay Area in the mid-90s, kind of the Netscape had just kind of happened, and there were a lot of young people making money. And at that time, I was living with some friends who we had an intention to make movies, but none of us had any money. And so being young and naive, we said, well, okay, I made an agreement with them. You learn how to make movies, and I'll go make money so that we can make movies about, broad concepts around the social ecological crisis that was happening in the world, and, the stories that could share a vision for a different world. And so I started getting into technology and entrepreneurship, discovering very arcane knowledge, things that I never wanted to know. How do you raise venture capital? How do you hire hundreds of people and scale up? And, in the early days of the web, commerce, what's a sticky GUI? Literally, we talked about sticky GUIs, graphical user interfaces, for those of you who are not familiar with a sticky GUI. And, I was involved in that for a number of years and had some interesting experiences, but never made one of those movies that I was really passionate about trying to and aspiring to make, to share. And some friends introduced me to ecosystemic design and permaculture. And over a little short period of time, I had a transition where I, sold my home, sold my car, radically simplified my life, and started a deep exploration of things that I was excited about. The transition that was happening in my life was moving from a kind of depression and overwhelm of, I think, cynicism and resignment about the state of the world, where all I saw was problems and suffering, to a worldview where I saw a tremendous number of opportunities to solve problems, and the solutions or the ways of addressing those problems suddenly became self-evident and almost embarrassingly simple. And so I wanted to become really literate, and I found a passion for researching, exploring, integrating, sharing about solutions, dedicating myself to a vision for, how could you create a world that works for everyone with no one left out for all life? What would that world look like? And how would it become manifest? What are the things that people would do to make that happen, or not do, as the case may be? It was around that time, in that part of my life, where I met Sean Barry. He had started a NGO called the Urban Alliance for Sustainability, and we were operating as a kind of a collective or a cooperative, and developing our mission, our theory of change, and seeing how we could inspire a movement of solutions, as we talked about it at the time. And we tried a number of things and learned a lot. But that's around that time where we started talking about the next economy.
Yeah, so this sort of, you had these sort of inclinations towards something different, and you met Sean, and then Sean had already started being interested in sort of business coaching and systems. How did the two of you actually decide what Lyft economy would look like, or what were the resources or inspirations, or how did you even decide on company structure on those early days?
Yeah, well, vision first, right? So an alignment first, as we often share with the clients and organizations that we get to work with and partner with. The genesis of kind of our interest in business and enterprise and economy as a lever for change just comes out of some observations that might be self-evident to a lot of us. If you look around the world and you see suffering, whether it's environmental suffering and degradation, destruction, topsoil loss, species extinction, gross emissions, climate change, every major ecosystem in the world is in radical decline, or human suffering, hunger, thirst, and homelessness, and poverty in general, and inequity, and the structural inequities of the world. It's not too far down of an analysis where you kind of see the economic system, the system of the economy, which has popular expressions like corporations and the way capital works. But the system of the economy is one of the probably core causative agents, as far as we could tell. And so in the work that we were doing as a nonprofit with Sean, we found that some of the most exciting areas where we saw what we thought was like progress or change or transformation was happening when we were working with worker-owned cooperatives and local small businesses that were authentically dedicated to a vision for doing business completely different than the norm of how an enterprise would operate. How can we provide or offer needed goods and services to the world, provide our gifts, the things that we're passionate about, that we're urgent about, but do it in a way that's just fundamentally different, non-compromising in terms of how could we be of benefit to the earth, how could we be of benefit to people, the people that we work with, the people that we partner with. And it turns out that's pretty hard to do. And we met a number of these entrepreneurs and courageous leaders who were trying to do that. And both Sean and I had an alignment for recognizing that the economy and business seemed to have this important role to play in transforming the larger cultural norms and social structures, and even the deeper story of who we are and identity as people, to enable this world that works for everybody. And we became interested in this idea of, okay, how can we be of service to the emergence of that next economy? And the thing that stood out first and foremost was Sean. You said Sean was interested in kind of business coaching. He kind of recognized that with his experience in running worker-owned cooperatives and running business, that he was he was going to be able to be of service. And I had similar experiences, and we met these entrepreneurs who were running these companies, and by and large, they were passionate and dedicated, but a lot of them were missing some of the kind of experiences and knowledge about how to grow an enterprise or run a business or hire people or access resources or make decisions that are in alignment with their values when the default decisions are kind of along the lines of the business as usual economy. And so we said, well, okay, we know we can probably be of service and create value there. Let's try that on. But in doing so, what's interesting, Ryan, is we were researching and talking and spent a good amount of time charting out a pathway for what would the economy look like if it was working for the benefit of all life. And so we asked ourselves that question, and it's a really potent inquiry, I think. What would it look like in as much detail as possible? And in doing that, in kind of exploring that inquiry, we found we had to play with time quite a bit and dilate out through time because it seems so distant from here when there's just so much exploitation and suffering at the hands of business and enterprise. So we started talking about, well, what would a 500-year plan be? What would the plan for an economy be that could create such a world that we can aspire towards? One of the things that really got us excited and motivated to work with people was, have you ever heard of that William Gibson quote, the future is here, but it's just not evenly distributed, or something like that? I'm paraphrasing for sure, but yeah, it was evident to us that the next economy isn't something that's just science fiction or fantasy. It's actually now, it's just not everywhere. And so the first theory of change we had is, okay, let's start with helping those organizations that are already authentically dedicated to this higher principled way of providing needed goods and services, help them become the ideal as possible of an expression of that future world. And if we do our job well, they could be a model so that other enterprises and individuals could kind of follow their lead. They would create a draft that the next economy could kind of flow through and flow into or flow with. And that was kind of the genesis of Lyft Economy's vision. And we just built layers of specificity of our vision on top of that.
So most external people haven't seen our vision articulation, but I think it's interesting, and I actually don't know all the reasons why there are certain choices made. So it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on some of these, so there's 5 iterations. There's Lyft 1.0 to 5.0. And can you describe perhaps, so is Lyft 1.0, or did you already have this in mind in that first year with Sean? Or was this sort of added on as you went along, this idea of like what Lyft Economy specifically would do?
A lot of it was there in that work kind of visioning and setting intention about how we think we could be of service and what would serve us and the kind of even the life aspirations that we have. And I'll go into some examples of how that plays out through the vision. But there's kind of you could say a core theory of change in there, that if there were more models of enterprises or organizations or groups of people who are providing needed goods and services in this non-compromising, beneficial way, that could be models that could be replicated and regionally adapted. You could kind of imagine that there could be this locally self-reliant economy, a bioregional economy for every region of the world that's largely self-reliant. Obviously, there would be exchange and exchange of ideas and sharing across regions and celebration of cultural diversity and regional diversity. But there would be more resilience kind of built into each region. When you start thinking about an economy that does work for everybody, where no one's left out, you kind of get drawn into that idea. So how could you imagine getting there? So if you start with organizations that are already doing good work and create models that pull more organizations into that, then there seems to be some barriers to creating more of those. And some of the barriers I think we talked about maybe on the last time we did a podcast. One of them is what we call the price parity paradox. In short, in summary, if you invest in people and invest in the planet while producing goods and services, your cost basis for providing goods or services tends to be higher than the business as usual economy that tends to exploit people and planet and have a lower cost basis. So it creates a paradox of how do you create a price parity. And I don't know if we talked about it last time, but there's, Sean and I were looking at a number of ways to navigate through this paradox. And some of what you described as Lyft, what you mentioned there as 2.0 and 3.0 and 4.0 and 5.0 are some of the pathways through the price parity paradox. Some of those, just in summary, for example, are looking at the cost of capital and capitalization and how it works in the business as usual economy. If we could change the norms and the culture around capital to act as a catalytic agent to enable these organizations to grow or to start, then that would be one slice of reducing that cost basis to enable pricing or market of goods and services closer to parity. And then there's an idea of what if you did have these models of, community supported kitchens, or pick your model that were distributed everywhere around the world, and imagine for a moment if they were federated and connected and communicating and sharing in information and practices, sharing in learning, sharing in resources, sharing in maybe even supply relationships or in marketing relationships or connection relationships to people that they want to serve. There's a huge amount of power that could be leveraged by this idea of regionally replicable models of beneficial, socially and environmentally beneficial organizations providing needed goods and services that are federated and sharing. And so the Lyfts vision from just let's serve those entrepreneurs and organizations and individuals who are in the co-ops and so forth that are doing good work today evolved into, okay, well, once we've started helping them, let's change the nature of how capital intersects into engendering more of those organizations. And then let's federate those organizations so that they're able to have some more power parity with the business as usual economy. And there's more detail to it than that. Like you said, Ryan, if listeners haven't had the chance to read the Lyft 75-year vision statement articulation, then some of this will be just summary. But there's a lot more detail there.
So it went from this sort of Lyft 1.0, which is sort of consulting services around like vision, strategy, culture, operations for existing enterprises that are sort of already there and you want to help sort of be better businesses. And then it's, we've on the Lyft vision, it talks about this sort of Lyft 2.0, which is now sort of dabbling in the impact capital, accelerating and creating new companies. Can you talk about why not just continue to help companies who are already there and just grow those companies? Like why sort of raise money or, what's the point of that?
Well, one is a kind of fairly practical consideration in that Sean and I found ourselves in this situation where we were helping inchoate or nascent organizations with extraordinarily powerful and audacious ideals and vision. And we would meet with them and there would be just a massive amount of alignment and this pursuit of mutual support. Hey, we need your help. And we'd say, we'd love to help you. And then, Sean and I would dig into the organization and say, wow, there's absolutely no resources here, no cash. And Sean and I want to help you. But fee for service doesn't make sense for us to actually be consultants at the stage you're at. And that happened a lot. So we did a lot of pro bono work in supporting these small organizations to help them at these early stages. And so one thing, and in doing so, there's some consistent observations. For example, some of the most inspiring organizations we worked with were founded by women or persons of color. And, by observing their experiences, we saw that oftentimes there was a either outright or at least a residual kind of categorical exclusion of those entrepreneurs from kind of the capital stack by either investment culture or, again, these residual structural racism and structural sexism kind of barriers. Even if it was an organization that could access capital, their choices to prioritize impact and value creation for their supply chain, doing the most regenerative, beneficial thing in their supply chain, or their choices to invest in their people and be a model of personal growth and development for the people that they were bringing into the organization as team members, those choices were antithetical to the kind of constructs that the mandates of capital, the capital that might have been available for them, even if they had this amazingly innovative good or service that was going to be high impact. A lot of the capital out there was saying, well, you got to have outsized growth and provide, liquidity on a short time frame and a return profile that's conforming with our expectations that we've set for our limited investment partners and so forth. And those created additional barriers. So it's an emergent thing, and in the impact investment marketplace, there are others, but we saw a need to kind of add to the mix of what role could we play to helping define or even model again, set an example of how capital could work for these organizations that were more modest in their growth ambitions, and also way more authentic in their dedication to impact. Where's the capital for them? And how simultaneously could we create model a more diverse and inclusive economy? And so both the practical considerations of how do we grow the capacity of these organizations so that they might be able to pay us fee-for-service money so that we could actually work with them while feeding our families, so forth. When we could have chosen to become a nonprofit and looked for philanthropic support. But that has its own problems, actually, for the model that we were pursuing. Is we have to inquire about where that philanthropic support kind of comes from and what being dependent upon that might mean for us in terms of the kind of almost the energetics of reciprocity. So for us, not the easiest pathway by any stretch, but the most beneficial one would be, what if we could just intervene in the system by modeling a better way for capital to work for these high impact outcomes? And so that's what you're saying, Ryan, is Lyft 2.0, as you know well.
Yeah, and then
it's kind of
this sort of terminology, but it's helpful, I think, to think of it as like iterations. So the 3.0, it sounds like just is more. It looks like it's just a larger fund, right? A revolving loan fund. Can you describe what sort of that might mean for folks?
Yeah, I think it is more of another iteration on it, an elaboration of this kind of the restructuring of the culture of capital, taking the pilot of testing Lyft 2.0 and creating more evergreen structures where there's a entry point in for investors or a pool of investors, maybe quote unquote retail investors who can crowdfunding. So accessing different asset classes in different parts of kind of the world of capital, kind of the public equity at large, and leveraging that into a fund that maybe still provides returns, but the returns could be cycled and revolved back into generating more beneficial impact and transformation of the economy. And so Lyft 3.0, which, as you know, Ryan, we're kind of teasing some of that right now. It's still a little bit in the future, is kind of an exploration of what are the ideal models that could prioritize the outcomes we want to see at a little bit larger scale than the Lyft 2.0 and different structures. And, as you know, per our way of operating, I can't tell you exactly what that looks like because there's a healthy amount of trial, error, sensing, responding, and development as we go. Yeah.
And this is, so as we get into like Lyft 4.0 and 5.0, it's sort of very speculative, but, I like the idea of you and Sean sort of creating the detailed vision, because I think it helps us navigate. So Next Economy Coalition. So Lyft 4.0 is you said timeline here is 5 to 75 years. I like that. Hedging. And this idea of emphasis on transactions between regional social enterprises. You broker relationships to stimulate a robust, replicable regional economy. You work on replicating it in other regions, coalition building. One question listeners may have is, what's the beef that Lyft may have with something like Seventh Generation or like Patagonia or like some of the companies that we think of as impact? There, Seventh Generation isn't regional to Vermont, and Patagonia is not just a Ventura company. They sell everywhere. So
Sure.
how does that how do those types of companies fit into like what Lyft sees as the future vision of the economy?
Yeah. Well, the vision, the role that those organizations are playing kind of fits into this kind of story of transformation of the economy. One thing that we observe directly and might be self-evident to listeners who have seen this is when people kind of jump, if you will, fully into reinventing the norms of culture or the economy, it becomes a pretty isolated, lonely space pretty quickly, maybe culturally invisible. There's very little personal security, very little resources. If you're trying to engineer and test and experiment or midwife in the kind of the new of what you see as possible. In fact, the character of the archetype of the person who kind of does that, they tend to be very courageous, but sometimes there's personality types that create communication barriers, and sometimes they're a little bit thorny as characters, but certainly courageous, and we celebrate that work. And then there's kind of other approaches which are taking a stand for being a little bit closer to the norms of the existing economy, the business as usual economy, how enterprises typically function, but beginning to innovate and do things maybe at first just a little bit less bad, and then aspiring further and further, reaching towards being maybe do no harm, which is in and of itself very challenging to do within the constructs of the existing economy, and then moving towards how can we be slightly beneficial, how can we be very beneficial, how can we be totally beneficial. And there's almost like a meeting point, I don't know if they ever meet, but where those people who have, some of the entrepreneurs we worked with who are just starting raw, radical new structures and ways of doing, providing needed goods and services, people who are skeptical of even the term business, where that kind of intersects with some of the Seventh Generations or Patagonias. And so, right, the way Lyft holds that transformation, or that what's happening is that these Patagonias and Namaste Solars and Seventh Generation, great organizations that are doing really, really important work by taking a stand for that less bad, or do no harm, or even as beneficial as possible economy, trying to model better behavior. What we see is, whereas if they're not the ultimate expression of the 500-year transition to an economy that works for the benefit of all life without compromise, their work today actually makes the midwifery, the challenging, the courageous work more visible and more resourced and more relevant and more accessible. So they are playing this fairly catalytic role. And it turns out it's actually really, really challenging. We, as you know, Ryan, we've had the pleasure of working with some of these organizations and working with the leadership, and finding the leadership kind of, instead of thinking that they are the paragon of what is the best for regeneration or sustainability, I'm finding a lot of humility and a kind of expression like, yeah, we're doing our best, but we know there's a long way to go. And how could we go even further? How could we play this role of being a model? And so there is this really critical role to play of these organizations, that some of the B Corps, Ryan, that we work with, kind of play this role where they're authentically aspiring to say, what can I do within the constructs of the economy to set a higher bar for impact, and even measure it, and create a community around it. I think that's really important work. This 4.0 kind of, if you said there was these isolated, regionally replicable models of more ideal organizations that are perfect, if you will, or as close to perfect as possible expressions of the principles of an economy that truly was working for the benefit of all life, their power is very limited compared to the business as usual economy, the Walmarts or the Nikes or whatever. And so by connecting them together, federating, creating a field where they are building themselves into supply webs or relational webs of providing needed goods and services in concert with each other, again, is one of the critical pathways through the price parity paradox. And I guess I would just posit the way you asked the question. Patagonia, Seventh Generation, and such are making those fields, the field of the next economy around, say, textiles, like the fiber shed work that Rebecca Burgess is doing. That field becomes more possible when Patagonia or VF Corporation or some of the organizations that have taken a stand to support some of that work as part of their impact. That field becomes more possible. So we've started doing some field building, and Lyft 4.0 it will emerge into a more concerted effort to create these federated networks of organizations that are trying to reinvent the nature of the economy.
I think what's always surprised me is when I was younger, I used to assume that people would are already doing certain things. Oh yeah, there's already a group of investors who are getting together and talking about radical investments in women of color owned enterprises and that are non-extractive or non-dilutive in their terms. And you just see, wow, that doesn't really, I just have always been surprised at how much power there is in when someone has a good idea to sort of how much power you have to bring it into the economy and sort of push it forward, as opposed to just assuming that someone else has sort of got it covered.
Yeah, I fully in accord with that. Just watching for those opportunities and not assuming that anybody else is doing it. And I think it's also the case that we're finding in the field building work that we're doing is whereas it might be true that it's not being done wholly or fully in a totally integrated way. I think there's an approach. Sometimes I see people look at field building and see that as maybe something to own. I think what I love about our Lyft team and the approach that we're engendering is this idea of okay, we don't need to own this. What kind of facilitative role can we play in helping bring the field together? Because there are some people doing that piece and there's some people doing that piece, and maybe they are communicating, maybe they're not. Let's test it. Let's set a convening and have a conversation. Then we'll check in. How was that? Was that valuable? Were connections made? Are any transactional relationships going to come of this that are going to benefit in mutual support everyone? And tracking that and just almost being really curious about it. So far, the early indicators are that that's going to be a potent part of what Lyft, an expression of Lyft's value to our mission in the world, hopefully, is to play that curious convener role.
The old curious convener role. So let's wrap this vision. So we got Lyft 5.0, which is the next economy holding company. So it's described as a holding company for non-extractive exit for next economy companies. It could finance co-op conversions. There could be a local stock exchange. Can you just talk about what is a holding company and what sort of purpose would it provide in the next economy?
Well, there's a nexus of kind of critical aspects when you think of the long-term trajectory of growing or transforming into an economy that works for the benefit of all life. One of the toxic cultural norms of the business as usual economy is this idea of succession or exit, and creating wealth inequities by the nature of how equity accrues to enterprise. and founders and owners and leaders, rather than having the benefits from goods and services being created, accrue to everyone, or be more distributed, more equitable. And, one of the missing pieces right now that we don't see as being addressed fully is what are the ways in which a organization or group of people could be providing needed goods and services in these non-compromising ways, being of authentic benefit to people and planet. And then as, say, the entrepreneurs or the people who started those organizations or grew those models, as they, say, age out, what happens to the organization? How does it get owned? Maybe it's cooperatively owned by the workers or a multi-stakeholder, but what are the possible stakeholders? And holding company is a rough kind of proxy for the various possible structures that might be able to hold such entities, so that their value and what they bring to reinventing the economy, the value that they bring to the planet, that they bring to people, can carry on. And we have some interesting ideas around that. We're, of course, Jenny Casson, one of our great partners at Lyft, is really brilliant in thinking about these novel structures. So we're very excited about some possibilities. And maybe it is, local stock exchanges in the long run that are different, where local equity holding, where local communities are the owners, or maybe it's just a federated set of multi-stakeholder cooperatives, or maybe it's, a business development corporation of a sort that's intersects with the existing economy a little bit, but also plays this new catalytic role. I think the nature of succession is the question. One of the cultural norms that is just insidiously toxic to life right now is that in the affluent world, you have this terrific bind where personal security and the strategies for personal security are normally centered around this idea of trying to accrue assets or wealth, if you're owning land or having retirement savings and putting it into the market to generate passive income. And these strategies very, surreptitiously kind of bind us into complicity in continued exploitation because of the way the economy is working right now, because of its norms. And having holding entities or other structures that could enable and encourage people to rethink personal security in different ways, where maybe there's not the impetus to accrue wealth and ownership as the only means for security. I think that's one of that Lyft 5.0 is a little bit to the future, as you know. So we do think about it a lot, all the time. And I'm really excited about it. And we track all these Lyft 1 through 5, as you know, Ryan, but maybe our podcast listeners don't. They're co-emergent. So we stagger them out by number or as if it's sequential, but they definitely kind of come all at once, just maybe at different pacing at different times. And I'm excited about this idea of reinventing. So think of Lyft 5.0 as the reinventing of personal security strategies. What would it look like in the economy if your basic motivation for personal security was to reduce your cost of living by securing the resource resiliency of food security, water security, energy security, and shelter, and loving relationships with your community in the place that you live, so you could really invest as a participant in the place that you reside and abide. And that was your strategy for personal security. And you didn't have to think about savings or wealth or ownership. You had more freedom to just be of ultimate expression of service to your community and really love people and connect, and that would provide for you. What would that look like if you just kind of ask that question and inquire thoughtfully without, falling into cynicism and resignment because we're so far from that? There's some very creative work being done, and I'm very excited for Lyft 5.0. Boy, you're getting me excited, Ryan.
I mean, I think the cynicism piece is important, because a lot of the things folks feel or see in the news and experience in their daily lives, and the things that we talk about maybe on this podcast or even in this vision or that we do at Lyft are so small, right, in comparison to the problems. So how do you reconcile that? Is it just sort of like, well, I'm not just gonna suck my thumb and curl up into a fetus position. So, but like, how do you sort of reconcile the cynicism with like what you're also seeing as what's possible?
Yeah, well, that's a great. I mean, I have a personal answer, I guess, and I'd hesitate to tell anybody what might work for them, but by sharing my own perspective, maybe it's helpful, or not. My perspective is, by immersing myself in what is possible and moving it from the realms of science fiction and fantasy and ideas, but into practice and seeing the outcomes, the beneficial impacts, seeing an ecosystem regenerated, restored, and habitat thriving, and normalization of hydrologic cycles and fecundity of nature, and seeing human relationships, seeing people become healthy and thriving and transformed, personally transformed and happy. When you seeing those outcomes happen, even in small scale, even if it's micro, just being involved in that work on a absorbed in it really day to day, it's almost impossible not to be optimistic. Paul Hawkins, one of our friends and allies, used to say, I'll very terribly paraphrase him, but he used to say something like, if you're looking at the numbers in culture and you're feeling optimistic, then you're not looking at the numbers. But if you're working with people who are working on the solutions and on a day-to-day basis and you're not feeling optimistic, then you don't have a heartbeat. Something like that. But I think that's one way to cut through some of the resignment and cynicism, is just to frankly get busy with manifesting what's possible. And then the question of like, how do you scale it? How does it really transform everything? In my experience, it becomes more, the best words I could say is self-evident. The possibilities suddenly appear as almost embarrassingly simple rather than like super complex and challenging. There's still challenges, no doubt, but most of them are, ego-systemic challenges rather than physical barriers. And no amount of forcing seems to be the pathway through those barriers. It's almost like inviting in the possibility that they could transform, by themselves, not because you want them to, because you've created space for them to. I know that sounds almost wishful and maybe naive, and it may be, but if it's something that provides energy and motivation and creates the enormous wealth of happiness and joy that comes from being of service to life, then I'm happy to be somewhat naive in that way. Staying connected with people and possibility, creating a language of possibility, in my experience, it keeps me imagining that things are very generative, and acknowledging that I think everybody on the Lyft team, right, has their days where some of the cynicism and some of this just the incredible grief and sadness of what's happening sinks in, and then having mechanisms to catch ourselves and reconnect. And it's really through people and allies creating a field, a place to go where it's okay to express that and then refocus and find that place of joyful service. And I also, one more thing, Ryan, for me, maybe know this about me, but for the listeners, and again, this is just my personal take, is I'm not attached to the outcome, right? If we don't make it to the 500-year plan of an economy that works for the benefit of all life, obviously, like I'm driven by that possibility, and I'm excited by it. And if we don't make it, it's, you know, it's okay, or that's not why we're doing it. One of my colleagues in permaculture at the Urban Permaculture Institute, David Cody, he says, you know, if it's not fun, it's not sustainable. So I think finding the joy in pursuing a vision of a world that works for everyone with no one left out, where that's authentically joyful, that is, I think, for me, the cleanest cut through of the cynicism. It's like, it's all of a sudden these really dramatic problems are, you know, it's almost like we created them for the joy of untangling them. I mean, that's maybe an overcorrection, but it's something like that.
Can you point folks to resources that have inspired you to sort of take that the higher road and sort of not feel too, I mean, Project Drawdown, probably looking at solutions to climate change, Charles Eisenstein, sacred economics. Like who are some of the sort of foundational, like if folks maybe know about Next Economy or they're interested in it, what are some like foundational resources they should maybe look to kind of learn more about what's possible in the space?
Yeah, I mean, some of what you mentioned, the work of Paul Hawkins and Charles Eisenstein, but there's really a lot. So it's for me personally, I've been inspired by the permaculture movement in general, David Holmgren, his writing and thinking, and I had the distinct privilege of learning from him as a student, so that the whole pedagogy of permaculture has deeply influenced me in seeing the world as a litany of possibilities and solutions. There's, you know, some authors that, you know, everybody from Jane Jacobs to Marjorie Kelly to Lynn Margulis and others that just have resonated over time, sharing a vision that have inspired this possibility of a world that's different. Schumacher comes to mind. I'm going to start looking around my room and look at the look at the books on my shelf. But those definitely, Charles Eisenstein, I think, is one of the more erudite thinkers today, thinking about kind of the economy and culture and those intersections. Yeah, those are some. I mean, I think if I were to talk about like some of the authors or writers or thinkers who are past, but who really inspire kind of the worldview that enables, that I think, I guess, really lights up my focus on service, would be, you know, Joseph Campbell or Alan Watts or even Robert Anton Wilson and some of those characters. Their perspective, I think, provides a lot of freedom for me to feel excited about transformation and different possibilities. So they're some of my intellectual heroes.
Awesome.
What about you, Ryan?
Frederick Laloux,
mm-hmm.
Reinventing Organizations.
So good.
I've just a lot of classical literature. Like, oh man, yeah. It's funny. Sometimes I find inspiration in sort of not reading about the solution, like not doing too much nonfiction, sort of like in it, trying to find solutions. Like I think part of the value is also sort of like stepping back and, into like some of the classical fiction. So, you know, like even like Huckleberry Finn and like, like Tom Sawyer, like, so that it's just like, I'm just really inspired by like, you know, classics that sort of take you away from sometimes like being too immersed in problems. So
just thought of another one. Oh gosh, and it's just in my favorite economist. She worked on kind of commons theory. Gosh, and now I'm forgetting her name, but I'm sure Andrew will put it in the podcast comments.
The other one Sean Baird would want us to mention is probably Prout's progressive utilization theory.
Absolutely. Prout is very inspiring.
So
actually, one more, Ernest Callenbach with Ecotopia and Ecotopia Emerging, very inspiring for me.
nice. Well, maybe next actions, we need to have a next economy reading list, because I think folks might benefit from that. Maybe it'll come from our next economy MBA coursework. But well, thanks, Kevin. It's been a pleasure. I can't believe it's been 100 episodes. It's been, we never intended the podcast to be, it was always sort of an internal communication tool for the Lyft team of like, what are you doing? Oh yeah, what are you doing? So now it's turned into interviewing amazing people. So hopefully here's to the next 100 episodes.
Yeah. Well, I've been delighted with people writing in and as we're out speaking or sharing that they're finding value in hearing these stories. That was one of our intentions, is just to share the stories from the field of what's actually happening, to make sure that people who are trying this stuff, experimenting with manifesting the next economy, that they feel connected to a larger movement. And, there are those thought leaders. I just remembered her name, Eleanor Ostrom.
Nice.
There's Eleanor, there's Buckminster Fuller. There's all these heroes and heroines who have come before us and provided just an enormous amount of inspiration and possibility. And there's just so many people around the world who are creating these things. I think if we can, for another 100, 200, 300, 500 more episodes and just feature their stories, and if that creates more connection to build this field, then I'll be very satisfied that this is a service. But for any listeners out there, if you haven't yet commented on however you're accessing this podcast and sharing with us what you'd like to hear more of, who you'd like to hear from, that's something that I'd really love to hear from you all, to make sure that we're continuing to create value.
Thanks, Kevin. So check us out, lifteconomy.com, Lift economy.com. And if you want to see the podcast and previous episodes, lifteconomy.com/podcast. Thanks for being on the show, Kevin.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lyft Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.